He was declared unfit by his own father, the king. He was the dynasty's tragic flaw, the broken prince, a living embarrassment to be managed, hidden, and ultimately disinherited. He was legally erased, forced to sign a document confessing his own handicap and renouncing his sacred birthright. The world knew him only as the deaf-mute who could never rule. And yet this same man would wage a silent, decades-long war using the very laws that had discarded him to prove that he alone was the true legitimate heir. He would die as Henri VI, King of France, Jaime III, King of Spain, and Jaime IV, Duke of Madrid, the symbolic ruler of three separate warring kingdoms. His name was Infante Jaime, the man they tried to silence. How did this unfit prince, this broken spare, turn the ancient rules of royalty against his own family and become on paper the most legitimate king in all of Europe? He was now the unfit prince, a living embarrassment, a symbol of the family's tragic luck. But was it just luck? This is the fateful twist, the dark secret that hangs over the entire story of the Spanish Bourbons. To understand why this single ear infection became a hinge of fate, one must look deeper, past the surgeon's knife and into the very blood of the prince himself. The House of Bourbon was, by 1912, arguably the most inbred royal family in all of Europe, a dubious honor in a continent full of consanguineous dynasties. They had inherited this tradition from their predecessors, the Spanish Habsburgs, a family so famous for their intermarriage that they had literally bred themselves into extinction, their line ending in the famously disabled and sterile King Charles II, a man whose genetic profile was more akin to that of a child of siblings than a king. The Bourbons, upon taking the Spanish throne, had continued the practice with gusto, all in the name of political expediency and keeping the bloodline pure. This was not a metaphorical flaw, it was a matter of scientific fact, a policy of deliberate genetic reductionism. The family tree was not a branching, healthy oak, it was a withered vine, turning back in on itself again and again. Jaime's own great-grandparents, Queen Isabella II of Spain and King Francis of Assisi, were not just cousins, they were double first cousins. This meant their fathers were brothers and their mothers were sisters. Genetically, they were as close as brother and sister, and this was just one generation go back further, and the picture becomes even more claustrophobic. Ferdinand VII, his great-great-grandfather, had married his own niece. This relentless inbreeding does not create diseases out of thin air. What it does is create a genetic minefield. It takes rare, recessive, and harmful genes that are hidden harmlessly in the wider population, and by concentrating them, dramatically increases the chances of them pairing up. It is a game of genetic Russian roulette. The most famous consequence of this was the Habsburg jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism that was a visible marker of this inbreeding. But the unseen consequences were far worse: compromised immune systems, higher rates of infertility, and increased vulnerability to a host of hereditary conditions. This was the genetic tinderbox Jaime was born into, and his mother, Queen Ina, had brought the match. She, a descendant of Queen Victoria, was a carrier of hemophilia. This was a separate genetic curse, but it added to the toxic brew. The Spanish royal nursery was now home to two princes afflicted by hemophilia and one prince who was profoundly deaf. It was a statistical impossibility, a confluence of genetic tragedy that could not be explained away as simple bad luck. This is the true fateful twist. The 1912 operation was not an isolated event of medical misfortune. It is overwhelmingly likely that Jaime's body, compromised by centuries of inbreeding, possessed a weakened immune system. A simple ear infection that a healthier child might have fought off instead became a raging, life-threatening mastoiditis that required a desperate, invasive surgery. The very policy designed to protect the purity of the Bourbon bloodline was what had ultimately poisoned it. The dynasty's pathological obsession with its own exclusivity had created a generation of princes who were genetically fragile, vulnerable to diseases and infections that others would survive. The surgeon's knife was just the instrument. The true cause of Jaime's silence was his own ancestry. He was the living, breathing, silent symbol of a dynasty that was collapsing from within, a monarchy that had become so rarefied that it was literally decaying. He was born to be a king, but his own blood had rendered him unfit in the eyes of the world. He was the forgotten pretender, and his claims to the throne, which he would one day fight for, would be destined to echo only in the silence that had been carved into him by his own lineage. This tragedy was inevitable. Prince Jaime was crushed between two forces that could never be reconciled: the imperfect man he was and the perfect prince his world demanded him to be. This was not a stable, beloved storybook monarchy. This was Spain in the early 20th century, a kingdom of ghosts, an empire of memories. It was a nation living in the shadow of its own magnificent past, a past that hung over its present like a shroud, making its current decay all the more pathetic. The court of his father, King Alfonso XIII, was a world of rigid, suffocating formality, a place where tradition was a weapon and protocol was a form of armor against the terrifying modern world hammering at the palace gates. It was a world that had no vocabulary for failure, no tolerance for weakness, and no place for a prince who was imperfect. This world was not just a backdrop for Jaime's life. It was his first and most formidable antagonist. The old guard was personified by the king himself. Alfonso XIII was a man of staggering contradictions. He had been born a king. His father, Alfonso XII, died months before his birth, a fact that imbued him with an almost mystical, divine sense of his own right to rule. He was not a king by choice. He was kingship itself. He was charismatic, athletic, and possessed a reckless physical courage. He was a lover of fast cars, polo, and women, projecting an image of vigorous modernity. But beneath this veneer of a 20th century playboy beat the heart of a 17th century autocrat. He believed in the king's person as the absolute central pillar of Spain. He deeply distrusted democracy, viewing the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes, as a corrupt and inefficient talking shop, a necessary inconvenience to be manipulated or, if need be, bypassed entirely. He had inherited a political system known as the Turno Pacifico, a deeply cynical arrangement where two dynastic parties, the conservatives and the liberals, would simply turn over power to each other in rigged elections, orchestrated by local political bosses called caciques. This system, designed by Cánovas del Castillo after the restoration of the monarchy in 1874, had provided a veneer of stability for decades, but by the 1900s, it was rotten to the core. It excluded everyone else: the Republicans, the Socialists, the Anarchists, and the increasingly powerful regional nationalists in Catalonia and the Basque Country. It was a hollow crown, and Alfonso XIII, by actively intervening in politics, by playing the parties and the army against each other, put his own thumb on the scale, further discrediting the fragile illusion of a constitutional monarchy. This was the crumbling kingdom that King Alfonso was desperately trying to hold together, and his world was already defined by a profound, pervasive sense of national humiliation. The year 1898, a decade before Jaime's birth, was not a distant memory. It was a raw, open wound. The Spanish-American War, known in Spain simply as the disaster, had been a cataclysm. In a few short, brutal months, the United States had systematically dismantled the last vestiges of the 400-year-old Spanish Empire. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam were all lost. The Spanish fleet was sent to the bottom of the ocean in battles that were less like engagements and more like executions. This defeat stripped Spain of its world power status, leaving it a second-rate nation clinging to a few scraps of territory in North Africa. The Generation of '98, a new wave of Spanish intellectuals and writers, emerged to perform a painful national autopsy, questioning what was wrong with Spain itself, what sickness in its soul had led to such impotence. This national trauma bred a toxic atmosphere of resentment, recrimination, and a desperate desire to prove Spain's virility. This burden fell heavily on the military, which, despite its humiliation, saw itself as the only institution pure enough to save the nation from its corrupt politicians. The military became a bloated, top-heavy, and deeply political state within a state, constantly plotting, issuing manifestos, and viewing itself as the ultimate arbiter of Spain's destiny. This was the volatile armed faction that Alfonso XIII would have to appease, and one he would ultimately embrace. Into this pressurized, decaying world, the internal threats were just as potent as the external ones. The first and most immediate was the shadow that hung over the royal nursery itself, the genetic curse of the dynasty. As established, Jaime's deafness was not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a deeper systemic rot. The family's obsessive inbreeding, a policy designed to hoard power and purify the blood, had become its executioner. This was not a theoretical problem, it was a daily crisis of succession that defined the king's every move. The heir, Prince Alfonso, was a severe hemophiliac. This was a state secret, but one that was impossible to hide within the court. The young prince lived a life wrapped in cotton wool, a prisoner of his own blood. He was forbidden from running, from climbing, from any activity that could result in a minor bump or scrape, as any internal bleed could be a slow, agonizing death sentence. This reality had profound political consequences. Every courtier, every general, every foreign ambassador looked at the heir to the throne and saw not a future king, but a fragile boy who would be lucky to see 30. This placed an impossible weight on the spare, Infante Jaime. He was the only hope for a healthy, viable succession. And then at age 4, that hope was extinguished. The moment Jaime was confirmed as deaf, the succession crisis became an outright catastrophe. The line of succession now read as follows. First, a hemophiliac who could not rule. Second, a deaf mute who would not be allowed to rule. The entire future of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty now fell on the shoulders of the third-born son, Infante Juan, who had only been born in 1913. A year after Jaime's operation, the family now had a new and final spare. This internal dynamic would define the three brothers' lives. Alfonso, the heir, was pitied and protected Juan. The new hope was groomed and educated, particularly in the robust environment of the British Royal Navy, to be the future. And Jaime was the problem. He was the one to be hidden, to be educated separately, to be sent to special institutes in Germany and England, less for his own benefit and more to remove the visible, audible evidence of the dynasty's imperfection from the public eye. His father, King Alfonso, a man of action and physical prowess, reportedly found his son's disability to be a source of deep personal shame. In this restrictive world, Jaime was not a son to be nurtured. He was a dynastic flaw to be managed. This internal genetic threat was mirrored by an internal political threat that was just as intractable, the Carlists. The monarchy was not even united against its republican enemies. For nearly a century, Spain had been torn apart by a rival monarchist faction. The Carlists were an ultra-traditionalist, ultra-Catholic, anti-liberal movement that had first emerged in the 1830s. They believed that the liberal line of Queen Isabella II was illegitimate, and that the throne rightfully belonged to a separate, more legitimate branch of the Bourbon family, descending from Isabella's uncle, Don Carlos. They had fought and lost 3 brutal civil wars for this claim. They were not a fringe group. They were a powerful, deeply entrenched force, particularly in the rural, conservative regions of Navarre and the Basque country. They despised Alfonso XIII, viewing him as a godless, liberal usurper. This meant that the king was fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the Republicans and Socialists who wanted no king, and against the Carlists who wanted a different king. This schism fatally weakened the entire monarchist cause, and it was into this complex, bitter feud that Jaime would, decades later, find his most unexpected and fanatical allies. The external threats, meanwhile, were no longer just simmering. They were boiling over. The fragile Turno system was being torn apart by real violent social forces. In cities like Barcelona, the Rosa de Foc, a powerful anarchist movement, was waging a campaign of bombings and assassinations against an equally brutal cabal of factory owners. World War I, while Spain remained neutral, strained the economy to its breaking point, creating massive inflation and food shortages that led to the Trialist Revolutionary General Strike of 1917, which the army crushed with bloody force. The king, in the eyes of the left, was now a butcher of the working class. But the final nail in the coffin of the old system came not from Europe, but from Africa. Spain was desperate to build a new colonial empire in Morocco, a brutal, unpopular war of attrition against the Rif tribesmen. In 1921, this colonial dream turned into a national nightmare at the disaster of Annual. A poorly equipped and badly led Spanish army, which the king had personally encouraged to advance, was completely annihilated by Berber forces. Over 13,000 Spanish soldiers were killed, many of them butchered. The scandal was enormous. A parliamentary inquiry was launched, and its findings threatened to implicate high-ranking generals and even the king himself, who had allegedly supported the reckless advance. This was the ultimate crisis. The old guard was about to be exposed. The military was humiliated, the politicians were discredited, and the king was implicated. The system was on the verge of total collapse. And so in September 1923, the military did what it always did. It stepped in. General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of Catalonia, staged a pronunciamiento and declared martial law. This was the moment of truth for Alfonso XIII. Would he stand by his constitutional oath and defend the parliament? Or would he save himself? He chose himself King Alfonso XIII, welcomed the coup, dismissed the Cortes, suspended the Constitution, and empowered Primo de Rivera as a military dictator. It was a fatal, short-sighted gamble. He had tied his own fate and the fate of the monarchy to that of a single, strong man. For 7 years, the dictatorship worked. It brutally suppressed the anarchists, ended the Moroccan War, and engaged in massive debt-fueled public works projects. But it was a hollow stability. The need for change was no longer a political theory. It was an existential necessity. The old system was not just failing, it was dead, and the king himself had signed its death certificate in 1923. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Primo de Rivera's debt-based economy collapsed. His support evaporated. The king, seeing the writing on the wall, dismissed his dictator in 1930, hoping to be seen as a savior who could now restore constitutional order. But it was too late. He had ruled as an autocrat for 7 years. He was the dictatorship. In April 1931, the king, in a desperate attempt to show a return to normalcy, called for simple municipal elections. He was so deluded by the false calm of the dictatorship that he believed the people still supported him. The elections were not for parliament, just for local town councils, but they instantly became a national referendum on the king himself. The results were an avalanche. While monarchist parties won in the rural, cacique-controlled villages, the Republican and Socialist parties won by landslides in every single major city. The message was unequivocal. The urban, modern, and literate population of Spain had resoundingly rejected the king. The collapse was swift and total. The king's ministers warned him that the streets were filling with joyous crowds proclaiming the Second Spanish Republic. He asked his top general if the army would still fight for him. The answer came back. The army would not fire on the people to save the monarchy. The king was alone. He had alienated the left with his autocracy, and he had alienated the right by dismissing Primo de Rivera. He was a king with no subjects. On April 14, 1931, King Alfonso XIII, refusing to formally abdicate but acknowledging his defeat, fled the country. The entire royal family was bundled into cars and trains, fleeing into a humiliating exile. The restrictive world had finally and completely shattered. For Infante Jaime, now 22 years old, this was a moment of profound dislocation. His entire life had been defined by his rejection by this system. He was the imperfect prince, the silent, disabled embarrassment to a monarchy obsessed with image. And now that monarchy was gone. The rigid, unforgiving world that had constrained him, that had defined him by his deafness and his halting speech, had itself proven to be the ultimate failure. It was the system that was flawed, the system that was rotten, the system that had been intolerant not just of him, but of modernity, of democracy, and of its own people. He was now adrift, an exile without a country, stripped of his royal status and his vast properties. But in this complete and total collapse, there was a strange, terrifying freedom. The old guard was dead. The restrictive world was in ruins. For the first time in his life, Jaime was no longer just the unfit prince. He was a man free to build his own destiny, far from the whispers and the pity of a court that was now nothing but a historical footnote. The world that had tried to silence him had been silenced itself. He was, in personality and temperament, the complete and total opposite of the old guard he had left behind. His father, King Alfonso, was a man of action, an extrovert who lived in the public eye, a fast-driving, polo-playing, womanizing king who ruled by his charismatic and often flawed instincts. His younger brother, Infante Juan, the new spare, was being molded in the same image. He was sent to the British Royal Navy, a robust, able-bodied, and conventional man's man, groomed for the practical, physical, and political duties of a modern monarch. Jaime was none of these things. His world, having been plunged into silence at age 4, had forced him to become a creature of observation, intellect, and profound inner resilience. He was the quiet center of the family storm. While others talked, he watched. While others commanded, he read. His disability, rather than crushing his intellect, had sharpened it. He was not the deaf mute of popular cruel caricature. He was a survivor, a man who had spent 2 decades meticulously and exhaustingly rewiring his brain to function in a world that was not built for him. His mastery of communication was not a gift. It was a hard-won victory, a testament to a will of iron. He had been sent to specialized institutes for the deaf, But his true education came from his own relentless discipline. He became a master of lip reading, a skill that is less a science and more a form of high-level guesswork, a constant draining process of inference and pattern recognition. And he did not just master it in Spanish. Living in exile, he became a fluent lip reader in French, Italian, English, and German. This was an intellectual feat of the highest order, one that none of his able-bodied family members could match. He was, in effect, a polyglot of the silent world. His speech, too, was a product of this same relentless effort. Having never clearly heard his own voice, it was difficult to moderate, often guttural and halting, but it was his. He refused to be silent. He worked tirelessly with speech therapists to be as intelligible as possible. He could, and he did, communicate his thoughts. This combination of profound silence and effortful speech gave him an air of intense, thoughtful gravity. He was pragmatic, not impulsive. He was intellectually curious, diving into subjects like art, history, and the new fascination of the age, aviation. He was a man who listened with his eyes, a man who thought before he spoke, a man who understood what it meant to be sidelined and underestimated. He was, in short, everything the rigid, impulsive, and appearance-obsessed Spanish monarchy was not. He was the mold breaker, waiting for his moment. That moment, paradoxically, would begin with his ultimate rejection. The first years of exile were defined by a new internal family crisis. In 1933, his older brother Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias and heir to the non-existent throne, committed the ultimate dynastic sin. The frail hemophiliac who had lived his life as a virtual prisoner of his own blood fell deeply in love. The object of his affection was a beautiful, charismatic Cuban commoner named Edelmira San Pedro Ochejo y Robato. For the exiled king Alfonso XIII, this was an existential threat. The monarchy was already gone. All he had left was the purity of its bloodline, the legitimacy of its claim. A marriage to a commoner, a morganatic marriage, would invalidate the heir and pollute the line of succession in the eyes of the hardcore Spanish monarchists he was counting on to restore him. He gave his eldest son a brutal ultimatum: the woman or the throne. The young prince, perhaps knowing his hemophilia meant he would not live long anyway, and having found a love that transcended the cold calculus of dynasty, chose love. On June 11, 1933, in Lausanne, Switzerland, Alfonso formally renounced his rights to the throne of Spain for himself and all his descendants. He was given the lesser title, Count of Covadonga, and, for a few brief years, he was happy, before a minor car accident in 1938 caused a fatal internal hemorrhage, just as the family had always feared. With the heir's renunciation, the line of succession, by every law that had governed Spain for centuries, moved one step down. Suddenly, all eyes in the small, embittered world of the royalist exiles turned to Infante Jaime. He was now, by right of primogeniture, the Prince of Asturias, the de jure heir to the Spanish throne. For a brief flickering moment he held the future of the Bourbon dynasty in his silent hands. It was a moment that his father, King Alfonso, could not and would not permit. The king was a pragmatist above all else. His single-minded goal was the Restauración, and he believed that presenting a flawed heir to the Spanish people, and more importantly, to the powerful generals who would be the ultimate arbiters of any restoration, was political suicide. How could a deaf king lead an army he couldn't hear? How could a man with a severe speech impediment negotiate with the cynical, fast-talking politicians of a new Spain? It was unthinkable. He saw Jaime's disability not as a challenge to be overcome, but as an insurmountable disqualifying obstacle. This is where the foil, the man who represented the path not taken, became the central figure. The king already had his solution, his third son, Infante Juan, the Count of Barcelona. Juan was everything Jaime was not. He was 20 years old, healthy, robust, and outgoing. He was the product of the very system that had rejected Jaime trained in the British Royal Navy. He was a military man, perfectly suited to the militaristic, right-wing forces that were coalescing back in Spain. He was able-bodied, politically astute, and could project the image of strength and normality that his father believed was essential. In the king's cold, pragmatic calculus, Juan was the only viable heir. Jaime was a problem to be solved, a knot to be cut. 10 days after his brother's renunciation on June 21, 1933, King Alfonso XIII summoned Jaime to a meeting. We will never know the exact words spoken, the precise emotional pressure or moral violence that was applied. We only know the context. A 24-year-old son who had spent his entire life being treated as less than by a powerful, autocratic father upon whom he was still financially and emotionally dependent. The king, obsessed with his restoration, would have been brutally clear. He would have told Jaime that he was a liability, that his sacrifice was necessary for the good of the dynasty, for the good of Spain, that to insist on his rights would be an act of profound, unforgivable selfishness, a betrayal that would guarantee the Republicans would rule forever. He would have been told that his brother Juan was the only hope. It was a checkmate. Jaime was handed a pre-written document, a renunciation of his own. It was a legalistic, humiliating text. In it, he was made to confess his own unfitness. The document stated that he was not unaware of the handicap of his deafness and speech impediment, and that for this reason, he was renouncing his own rights to the throne, and, crucially, the rights of all his future descendants. He signed it. It was the ultimate public humiliation, a formal declaration, signed by his own hand, but written by his father's, that he was unfit to reign. He was cast out of the line of succession. In exchange for this sacrifice, he was granted a personal, non-hereditary title, the Duke of Segovia. His younger brother, Infante Juan, was now the official Prince of Asturias, the undisputed heir to his father's claims. The rivalry that would fester and define the rest of their lives, a bitter feud between the chosen son and the rejected son, was now cemented in ink. But this act, intended to be the final definitive end of Jaime's story, the moment he was erased from history, instead became the catalyst for his rise. By signing that paper, he had fulfilled his final painful duty to his father. He was, in his own mind, free. The king had cut him loose. He owed him, and the political project of his brother Juan, nothing. He was no longer the disabled prince waiting in the wings. He was his own man, the Duke of Segovia, a prince of the blood even if he was not in the line of succession, and his very first act as a free man was to build the one thing his renunciation was supposed to make irrelevant, his own dynasty. 2 years later, on March 4th, 1935, in Rome, Jaime married. This was his first true act of defiance. His bride was Emmanuelle de Dampierre, a woman of high French and Italian nobility, the daughter of the Duke of San Lorenzo, and a princess of Ruspoli. This was significantly not a morganatic marriage. In the complex world of dynastic law, she was his equal, a member of the high aristocracy. This was a strategic alliance, a signal that he was not retiring from the world. Emmanuelle was beautiful, fiercely intelligent, and strong-willed. She became his partner, his advocate, and his voice. She learned sign language to communicate with him, and she became the public-facing duchess, the shadow queen of his new independent court. This marriage was the foundation of his shadow court, a statement of intent. He was building a life his father had deemed impossible, and then that defiance bore fruit in the one way a dynasty truly understands. On February 25, 1936, Emmanuel gave birth to a son, Alfonso. A year and a half later, on August 20th, 1937, a second son, Gonzalo, was born. This changed the entire game. Everything was different now. Jaime was no longer just a handicapped individual. He was the father of two healthy, able-bodied, dynastically legitimate sons. And these sons, by the simple ancient laws of blood and primogeniture, had a stronger claim to the throne than their uncle Juan, who was, after all, the third son, yes, Jaime's 1933 renunciation had barred them. But renunciations, as history had shown, were just pieces of paper, often signed under duress. Blood, on the other hand, was blood. A seed of a new vision was planted, a modernized monarchy, one that could look past the physical, one that could be led by his son. The final crucial piece of his rise fell into place in 1941. His father, the exiled king Alfonso XIII, died in Rome. His death had two immediate and profound consequences. The first was that Jaime's brother, Juan, the Count of Barcelona, immediately declared himself Juan III, de jure, King of Spain. He was now the official head of the Alfonsist cause, the main branch of the Spanish monarchy, the second. And for Jaime, the most important consequence was that he was now finally free. The man who had extracted his renunciation, the man to whom he had sworn his filial obedience, was gone. His forced oath had died with his father. And this is where the mold breaker, the quiet, strategic, underestimated prince, made his first brilliant and audacious move. He looked beyond Spain. He remembered that his father was not just the king of Spain. By the rules of strict male primogeniture, the Spanish Bourbon were also the senior-most descendants of King Louis XIV of France. They were, in the eyes of the legitimist faction of French monarchists, the true kings of France. His father and his grandfather before him had renounced this French claim as part of a complex series of treaties and political maneuvers, all to secure and solidify their primary claim to the Spanish throne. His brother Juan was entirely focused on Spain. The French claim was an inconvenient historical distraction. But Jaime owed the Spanish line nothing. He had been formally and publicly expelled from it. He was a free agent. So in 1941, Infante Jaime, the silent Duke of Segovia, made a stunning declaration that echoed across the monarchist world. He declared that his father's and grandfather's renunciations of the French throne were invalid, that they were personal acts that could not alter the fundamental God-given laws of succession. And since he, Jaime, was now the senior-most male of the entire House of Bourbon, he was the rightful king of France and Navarre. He adopted the traditional title of the French pretender, the Duke of Anjou. To his new ecstatic supporters, he was now Henri VI, King of France. This was a masterstroke of dynastic politics. It was a game-changing victory conjured from the ashes of his defeat. He had been discarded by one kingdom, so he had simply, and with perfect legalistic logic, picked up another. This was not a hollow gesture. It instantly gave him a cause, a court, and a new powerful identity. He was no longer Jaime, the deaf prince. He was Henri VI, the rightful king of France. A new set of allies, the French legitimist intellectuals and aristocrats, flocked to him. They saw in him not a disabled man, but their rightful, long-lost sovereign, a man free from the taint of the collaborationist Orleanist branch of the family. He now had his shadow court in Paris. He had a vision. He would be the king his father never allowed him to be. He had his own title, his own court, and most importantly, his own heirs for this new French dynasty. He had broken the mold completely. He had turned his greatest weakness, his exclusion from the Spanish line, into his greatest strength, his freedom to claim the French one. He had a taste of power, a renewed sense of destiny, and this was just the beginning. From his new position as the French king in exile, he turned his gaze back toward Madrid, Spain. He decided was not done with him yet. The 1940s dawned on a world convulsed by fire and ideology. While Europe tore itself apart in the Second World War, Spain, under the iron-fisted rule of General Francisco Franco, remained a sullen, exhausted, and neutral spectator. Franco, the caudillo, had won his brutal civil war in 1939, establishing a nationalist, fascist-aligned dictatorship on the ruins of the Second Republic. He was in principle a monarchist. He had used the traditionalist monarchist forces, particularly the fanatical Carlist requete, as his shock troops. He understood that the monarchy was the only institution with the historical legitimacy to provide a long-term, stable future for his regime. In 1947, he would formalize this with the law of succession to the headship of the state, a masterpiece of autocratic cunning. The law declared Spain a kingdom, but a kingdom with no king. The throne was officially vacant. Franco, in his role as caudillo, was named regent for life, granting himself the unprecedented power to choose his successor, to name the next king of Spain from the Bourbon dynasty when and if he saw fit. The crown was not a right of inheritance. It was a prize in Franco's personal political game. This was the crisis, the power vacuum, that the old guard personified by Jaime's younger brother, Infante Juan, the Count of Barcelona, was utterly incapable of handling. Juan, as the designated heir of Alfonso XIII, believed the throne was his by right. From his comfortable exile in Estoril, Portugal, he made the catastrophic political miscalculation of believing he could pressure Franco from the outside. He embraced a liberal monarchist platform, distancing himself from the fascist regime. In 1945, he issued the Lausanne Manifesto, a public declaration calling for Franco to step aside and allow the immediate restoration of a democratic, constitutional monarchy, one that would be a monarchy for all Spaniards and integrate with the new democratic post-war Europe. To Franco, who had just consolidated his power after a war that cost 1 million lives, this was not just a political disagreement. It was an act of rank treason. He despised Juan, viewing him as a naive, arrogant, and ungrateful pawn of the liberal Masonic conspiracy he believed ruled the West. This feud between the dictator and the pretender created a political impasse. Juan, the official heir, had made himself politically toxic, an enemy of the one man who held the keys to the kingdom. The throne sat empty, and Franco was now actively, quietly searching for an alternative. This was the opportunity Infante Jaime had been waiting for. He had spent the war years consolidating his new French identity as the Duke of Anjou, building his shadow court of legitimists. He had watched the feud between his brother and Franco with the keen, silent observation that had defined his entire life. He had been cut loose from the main line, and this, he realized, was not a curse but a profound strategic advantage. He was not Juan. He was not the liberal heir. He was the other Bourbon, a man with an equally valid, in fact, a more valid by primogeniture claim. And he had no record of opposing the caudillo, but before he could make his political move, he had to clear the decks of his personal life. His first act of this new aggressive phase was not a manifesto but a divorce. His 1935 marriage to the noblewoman Emmanuelle de Dampierre, the alliance that had given him his 2 sons and his first shadow court, had disintegrated. The reasons remained private, but the partnership, which had begun in defiance and hope, had soured into bitterness. In 1947, while in Bucharest, Romania, Jaime obtained a civil divorce. This was a shocking, ruthless act for a Catholic prince, especially one who would later need to appeal to the ultra-traditionalist, ultra-Catholic factions of Spain. It was a move that demonstrated a new cold-blooded pragmatism. He was severing his last tie to the conventional dynastic world his father had tried to force him into. He was now a complete free agent. He finalized this liberation from his past almost immediately. In 1949, in Innsbruck, Austria, he married again. His new bride was Charlotte Tiedemann, a German singer. This was not a dynastic match. This was a morganatic marriage, a marriage for love, or at least for companionship. It was a statement of profound, almost arrogant personal independence. It signaled to the world that he was done playing by the old rules. He was so confident in the fundamental God-given right of his own bloodline that he believed his wife's commoner status was completely irrelevant. He was the mold breaker, and he had just shattered the mold. With his personal life reset, he made his move. It was a political explosion that rocked the monarchist world to its foundations. On July 6, 1949, Infante Jaime, Duke of Segovia and Anjou, released a public letter, a manifesto that was the culmination of 16 years of silent resentment. He formally, publicly, and explosively retracted his 1933 renunciation of the Spanish throne. This was his game-changing victory. It was not a simple emotional, "I change my mind." It was a brilliantly crafted legal and moral argument designed to delegitimize his brother Juan and present himself as the only true lawful heir. His case rested on several powerful pillars. First, he claimed the renunciation was legally null and void because it had been extracted from him under extreme moral violence. He was a young man of 24. He argued financially and emotionally dependent on a powerful autocratic father who had exerted paternal authority to force his signature. He was, in effect, a victim of duress. Second, he argued that he had not fully comprehended the staggering, permanent scope of what he was signing. He claimed he did not understand that he was being forced to renounce the rights not just of himself but of his descendants, an act he now claimed he never would have consented to. But his third point was the legitimist masterstroke, the argument that would electrify traditionalists. He argued that the laws of succession were fundamental, divine, and immutable. They were a sacred pact between God and the nation, not a personal plaything of kings. Therefore, his father, King Alfonso XIII, had no legal power to demand such a renunciation, and he, Infante Jaime, had no legal power to grant it. His right to the throne was not his to give away. It belonged to the nation, it belonged to God, and it belonged by blood to his future heirs. His renunciation, therefore, was ultra vires, an act beyond his power, and had been legally void from the very second he had signed it. He was, and always had been, the true heir after his older brother's death. Finally, he directly confronted the handicap that his father had used as a pretext. He stated that his deafness, while a challenge, was in no way an impediment to ruling. He pointed to his mastery of 5 languages, his ability to communicate, and the advancements of the modern world. He implied clearly that his unfitness was a lie, a cruel excuse invented by his father to sideline him in favor of the younger preferred son. The outcome was immediate and devastating. He had thrown a political bomb into the monarchist camp, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. His brother Juan was no longer the sole undisputed claimant. The Alfonsist monarchists, who had been grudgingly united behind Juan, now split into two warring factions, the Juanistas, who supported the liberal Count of Barcelona, and the new, energized Jaimistas, who rallied to the banner of the legitimate king, the man who had been cheated of his birthright. In their eyes, Jaime was not just the Duke of Segovia, he was Jaime III King of Spain. But the most important audience for this manifesto was not the scattered exiles. It was the man in the Pardo Palace in Madrid. Francisco Franco was delighted. The feud he had with Juan was no longer a simple problem. It was now a complex political game, and he held all the cards. The monarchist cause was fatally divided, and he was the sole arbiter. He could now play the two brothers against each other, bleeding them both of their power and consolidating his own. He immediately recognized the utility of this other Bourbon. Jaime was, on paper, perfect for Franco. He was seen as far more conservative and traditionalist than his liberal brother. He was not tainted by any association with democracy. He was a blank slate, and perhaps a malleable one. Franco extended an invitation. Jaime traveled to Spain and met with the caudillo, presenting himself as the loyal, legitimate, and traditionalist alternative to his rebellious brother. Franco treated his claim with just enough public seriousness to send a wave of terror through Juan's camp. In one stroke, Jaime had done what his brother had failed to do for a decade. He had made himself relevant inside Spain. He was no longer a forgotten silent prince. He was Franco's other option, a dagger to be held permanently at his brother's throat. This was the peak of his power, but he was not done climbing. His gaze now turned to the other great monarchist faction in Spain, the Carlists. The Carlist movement, the ultra-traditionalist, ultra-Catholic faction that had fought 3 civil wars for their own rival line of kings, was in a state of terminal crisis. Their last direct king, Alfonso Carlos, Duke of San Jaime, had died in 1936 without a single heir. The direct male line of the original Don Carlos was extinct. This had created a succession crisis that had splintered the movement. The leadership had passed to a regent, Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma, a distant cousin from a different branch of the Bourbon family. But many of the Carlist rank and file, particularly a fiercely independent faction in Catalonia, led by Mauricio de Civate, rejected Xavier. They saw him as a foreigner, a man who was not of the true Spanish line, and worst of all, a man who was negotiating with Franco. These Civatistas were Carlist purists, anti-democratic, anti-liberal, and now anti-Franco. They were searching for a legitimate king, a king of pure, unadulterated Spanish Bourbon blood who was also a true traditionalist. And then in 1949, Infante Jaime made his move. The Carlist purists looked at him and saw not the deaf prince, but the perfect candidate. He was the senior male line Bourbon of the entire house. He had just publicly declared war on his liberal brother Juan, earning their respect. His claim to the French throne already resonated deeply with their own fanatical devotion to ancient Salic law. He was to them the most legitimate man on earth. Over the next several years, this powerful Carlist faction began to court him. Finally, after a series of complex negotiations, they made their proclamation in 1964. This energized branch of the Carlist movement formally recognized Infante Jaime as their rightful king. They bestowed upon him the traditional Carlist title, proclaiming him Jaime IV, Duke of Madrid. This was the absolute breathtaking climax of his rise. He had achieved the politically impossible. He, the man rejected for his flaw, had now united in his own person the claims of the three great warring monarchist factions. He was Henri VI, King of France and Navarre, to the French legitimists. He was Jaime III, King of Spain, to the Alphonsist Jaimistas, who saw him as the true heir of Alfonso XIII. And he was Jaime IV, King of Spain, to the traditionalist Carlist Jaimistas, who saw him as the legitimate successor to their own line. He had completely and totally outmaneuvered his brother Juan, who was now just one claimant among many, and the one claimant that the dictator of Spain despised. Jaime, the silent prince, the mold breaker, the man who had been cast out by his own father, now stood on paper as the single most legitimate royal figure in Europe, holding symbolic claims to three different crowns. He had proven his system right. He had turned his greatest weakness, his exclusion, into his greatest weapon, allowing him to bypass the rules and play the game on his own terms. The world, it seemed, was finally in his grasp. And yet here lies the central crushing paradox of his entire existence. He was a king 3 times over, and he was a king of nothing. His kingdoms were committees of aging aristocrats, intellectual societies that published esoteric journals on Salic law, and factions of Spanish reactionaries who were themselves divided. His court was not the grand royal palace of Madrid or the Tuileries in Paris. It was a comfortable but decidedly non-royal villa in Switzerland, and later a modest apartment in Paris. His royal proclamations, his defiant manifestos were not read from a throne. They were typewritten letters given to the press or published in obscure legitimist gazettes. He was, in the most profound and tragic sense, a theoretical king. He had mastered the game of dynastic law, but he was utterly and permanently locked out of the reality of power. His public success was a brilliant, intricate illusion, and it was built upon a foundation of private, inescapable flaws that would ultimately consume his entire legacy. The first and most obvious fatal flaw was the one he had fought his entire life to deny: his deafness. We must be precise here. It was not the deafness itself that was the flaw, but what it symbolized, and more practically, what it prevented in the brutal physical world of 20th century power politics. His father had not been wrong in his cold, pragmatic assessment, even if his motives were cruel. A monarch in that era, particularly a king in waiting who needed to win his throne back, had to be a master of personal interaction. Power was projected. It was projected by a voice that could command a room of skeptical generals. It was projected in the smoky backroom deals with cynical politicians, a world of whispered asides, implied threats, and subtle shifts in tone. It was projected at state dinners, where the ability to charm, to network, to overhear a rival's conversation was a critical political tool. It was increasingly projected over the radio, the new magical medium that allowed a leader's voice to enter every home in the nation. This was a world of sound, and in this world Jaime was a ghost. His communication, while a triumph of personal will, was a political liability. Lip reading, even his masterful 5-language lip reading, was an act of constant draining concentration. It was reactive, not proactive. He could not participate in the fast, overlapping, multi-person conversations that define political life. He was always one beat behind, his eyes darting between speakers, piecing together the fragments of what was said. His own speech, the product of a man who could not hear his own voice, was guttural, halting, and difficult for the uninitiated to understand. This combination had a devastating practical effect. It made people uncomfortable. In the cold reptilian world of high-stakes politics, uncomfortable is a synonym for weak. He was an object of pity, a man for whom allowances had to be made, and power never makes allowances. Generals and politicians do not want a king, they must pity. They want a leader they can fear, respect, and follow. He could not, as his brother Juan could, pick up a telephone and call a friendly general in Madrid. He could not fly to Washington and make a personal, charismatic appeal for his cause to American diplomats. He was isolated, trapped behind a wall of silence that no legal argument, however brilliant, could ever breach. His reign was, by necessity, a reign of letters, a kingdom of the page. He was a muted monarch, and his symbolic silence was a fatal, insurmountable obstacle. But this physical flaw was only the visible symptom of a far darker secret, a flaw that was not personal, but systemic. It was the flaw of his blood. His deafness, as we have seen, was not a random lightning strike of medical misfortune. It was the direct, predictable outcome of a dynastic strategy that had turned into a genetic self-immolation. The centuries of relentless pathological inbreeding by the Habsburgs and their Bourbon successors had not purified the bloodline. It had poisoned it. It had created a genetic tinderbox, a family tree so turned in on itself that it was practically a wreath. The royal disease of hemophilia, which had killed his older brother Alfonso and his younger brother Gonzalo, was the most famous manifestation of this decay. It was the flaw in the blood itself. But Jaime's condition was just as much a part of this toxic inheritance, his body likely possessing a compromised immune system, a common result of such profound consanguinity as scientific literature on royal inbreeding has since detailed could not fight off a common childhood infection. The resulting mastoiditis required a desperate, invasive surgery that a healthier child might have avoided entirely. This was his inescapable existential tragedy. He was the flaw. He was the walking, breathing, silent proof of the monarchy's degeneracy, the very accusation that Spanish Republicans had leveled at his family for decades. He was the living embodiment of the black legend of the Bourbons. How could he possibly present himself as the savior of Spain, the symbol of a restored and vigorous traditional order, when his own physical body was a testament to that order's decadent, self-destructive past? He was the symbol of the dynasty's rot, not its rebirth. He and his hemophiliac brothers were the living arguments against the very monarchy. They were born to lead this dark genetic secret, which was no secret to any informed observer in Europe, made his entire political project a paradox. He was fighting for a system, a divine right of blood that had by its own internal logic produced him a man it then deemed unfit. It was a snake eating its own tail. And it was on top of this already impossible foundation that Jaime built his ticking bomb. He, the man whose entire claim rested on the sacred, immutable, fundamental laws of succession, made a series of personal choices that violated the other fundamental laws his new allies held most dear. His first catastrophic error was his 1947 divorce from Emmanuel de Dampierre. His second was his 1949 morganatic marriage to the German singer Charlotte Tiedemann. To a modern secular observer, this is a personal matter, but to the only people on earth who were willing to fight and die for his claim, the French legitimists and especially the Spanish Carlists, this was not a personal choice. It was a sacrilege. It was a spiritual betrayal. Let us be clear about who the Carlists were. They were not simply conservative monarchists. They were the armed ideological ancestors of modern religious fundamentalism. Their motto was Dios, Patria, Fueros, Rey. God came first, They were defined by a militant, almost medieval form of Catholicism. They believed the liberal monarchy of Alfonso XIII was illegitimate precisely because it had compromised with secularism, with parliament, with the godless modern world. To the Carlists, the king was not a politician. He was a sacred, anointed vessel of God's will, a king by the grace of God, who was answerable only to the Pope and to heaven. And the most sacred, non-negotiable fundamental law of God's church on earth was the indissolubility of marriage. Divorce was not a legal option, it was a mortal sin, an abomination. And now, Jaime IV, the man they had chosen as their pure traditionalist savior, had revealed himself to be a divorcee. He had cast aside his noble Catholic wife, the mother of his heirs, in a vulgar civil proceeding. And then he had remarried. And who had he remarried? Not a Catholic princess, not even a noblewoman. He had married a commoner, a singer, a Protestant. It is impossible to overstate the profound seismic shock this sent through his own support base. It was an act of such staggering hypocrisy that it bordered on the surreal. He was the man who had just written a manifesto claiming his father had no right to alter the fundamental laws of succession, and he had, in the next breath, spat upon the most fundamental law of his own religion. He was a traditionalist king who lived the life of a progressive, secular aristocrat. This hypocrisy was the ticking bomb. It was the fatal flaw that rendered all his strategic brilliance, all his legal victories, completely and totally moot. It was the weapon he handed free of charge to all his enemies. The Juanistas, his brother's supporters, now had the perfect, unimpeachable argument. See, they could say, this is the man who wants to be king. He is not just deaf, he is unstable, he is erratic, he is morally compromised. He has no respect for the church, for tradition, or for his own family. And the one man whose opinion mattered more than all the others, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, was given his ultimate out. Franco had built his entire regime on the ideology of Nacional Catolicismo, national Catholicism. He was the self-proclaimed sentinel of the West, the sword and shield of the Catholic faith against godless communism. His public image was one of austere, pious Catholic devotion. He could never place a divorced man, a man living in a state of sin, with a Protestant commoner on the throne of Catholic Spain. It was politically, ideologically, and personally impossible. It was the one disqualification that was even more potent than his deafness, but the most tragic consequence, the bomb that detonated with the most personal, devastating force, was the one that exploded within his own family. His entire life's fight, especially after 1949, was supposedly for the rights of his descendants, for his two sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo. His retraction had been, in his own words, to protect their inheritance, which his father had forced him to sign away. But his divorce from their mother, Emmanuelle de Dampierre, was bitter, public, and acrimonious. He had, in effect, alienated his own heirs. His sons were now trapped in the very dynastic limbo he claimed to be saving them from. What exactly were they heirs to? Were they princes of France, a title recognized by a few hundred people? Were they Infante of Spain, a claim their own great-uncle Juan, the head of the official royal family, furiously rejected? They were princes of a shadow kingdom, trapped between their father's grand, symbolic, and ultimately powerless claims, and the real royal family that now viewed them as rivals, as the sons of the disgraced black sheep. Their father's quest for his own vindication, his refusal to accept his fate, had not liberated them. It had cursed them. It had set them up for a lifetime of confusion, bitterness, and ultimately tragedy. The King of Three Kingdoms had, by his own hand, created a dynastic rift that would ensure his line would never rule any of them. The mid-1960s were, for Infante Jaime, the apex of his illusory power. He was the triple pretender, a man who, by sheer force of will and a masterful understanding of ancient law, had clawed his way back from total obscurity. He had fashioned himself into the single greatest legitimist figure in Europe. From his perspective, he had assembled a winning hand. He had the French legitimists providing him with a shadow court and a deep historical prestige. He had the Jaimista Alfonsists giving him a claim based on pure, direct primogeniture against his younger brother. And most potently, he had the Carlists, the Duke of Madrid title, which connected him to Spain's most fanatical, battle-hardened, and ideologically pure monarchist tradition. He believed he was presenting Generalissimo Franco with the perfect solution, a candidate who was not a liberal like his brother Juan, but a true traditionalist, a man who united all the fractured monarchist lines. This was his great tragic act of hubris. He fundamentally and fatally misread the man he was trying to impress. Jaime was playing an 18th century game of dynastic chess, a game of bloodlines, sacred laws, and ancient titles. Francisco Franco was playing a brutal 20th century game of totalitarian power. Franco, the caudillo, the man who had clawed his way to supreme authority from a modest military background, had nothing but contempt for these aristocratic parlor games. He didn't care about Salic law. He didn't care about primogeniture. He didn't care about the divine right. He had won Spain with cannons, with concentration camps, and with a will of iron. The throne was not an inheritance to be restored. It was a prize to be given, and it would be given to the man who would best serve Franco's one and only goal, the continuation of Francoism after Franco. Jaime believed his legitimacy was his greatest asset. In Franco's eyes, it was his greatest irrelevance. What Franco saw when he looked at Jaime was not a king, but a tool, a useful temporary pawn to torment, weaken, and delegitimize his true rival, the liberal Infante Juan. And by the mid-1960s, that tool had served its purpose. The very alliances that Jaime believed were his strength were, in fact, the first cracks in his crumbling facade. His new Carlist supporters were not a unified bloc, they were a hornet's nest. The Carlist movement itself was consumed by a bitter, multifaceted civil war. The faction that had recognized him, the Civitistas, were rabid purists. They were so traditionalist that they had come to despise Franco himself, seeing the caudillo as a godless fascist usurper of true royal authority. By aligning with them, Jaime had not made himself more attractive to Franco. He had made himself less so, marking himself as the figurehead of an unstable, fanatical, and, worst of all, disloyal faction. Meanwhile, the other major Carlist faction, led by Jaime's distant cousin, Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma, was playing a completely different game. They were trying to woo Franco, presenting themselves as a modern, socialist, and progressive alternative, even trying to infiltrate Franco's only legal political party, the Movimiento. The Carlist movement was now a three-ring circus with Jaime, Carlos Hugo, and the exiled Juan all vying for the crown, a spectacle of division that allowed Franco to hold all of them in contempt. But it was Jaime's fatal flaw, his 1947 divorce and 1949 remarriage, that had given Franco the unassailable public excuse to discard him. As the 1960s wore on, Franco's regime, built on the ideology of nacional-catolicismo, presented itself to the world as the moral bastion of the West, the dictator in public, was a man of austere piety. The idea of him anointing a divorcee, a man living in what the church considered a permanent public state of sin, as the king of Catholic Spain was not just politically difficult, it was a theological and ideological impossibility. It was the one line he could not and would not cross. Jaime, in his quest for personal happiness with Charlotte Tiedemann, had handed his greatest enemy the perfect, pious-sounding justification for his betrayal. He was not just deaf, he was morally compromised. Franco was now done with the games. He was aging. He needed to secure his legacy. He was tired of the feuding brothers, this damaged generation of exiles. He was tired of Juan's liberalism, Jaime's deafness and divorces, and the Carlist's unpredictable fanaticism. He needed a successor, not an heir. He needed someone young, someone loyal, someone who had no memory of the pre-Franco era, someone whose entire identity could be molded by the regime itself. He needed a blank slate, and he had found one. He looked past the two squabbling brothers and fixed his gaze upon the next generation. His chosen candidate was Juan Carlos, Infante Juan's eldest son. This was the great betrayal, a move of devastating cold-blooded genius. By choosing Juan Carlos, Franco accomplished all his goals in one stroke. First, he utterly humiliated his primary rival, Infante Juan. He was forcing the liberal father to stand aside and watch his own son leapfrog him to the throne, a public castration of Juan's authority. Second, he completely and permanently eradicated Infante Jaime. By selecting a member of Juan's line, Franco was officially and formally recognizing that the Jaimista claim was, and always had been, illegitimate. He was signaling to the world that Jaime's 1949 retraction was meaningless. His titles were hollow and his entire life struggle was a political fantasy. And third, and most importantly, he got the king he wanted. Juan Carlos had been brought to Spain at the age of 10, separated from his parents and educated in Madrid under Franco's direct personal supervision at military academies and a university. He was Franco's creation. And in 1969, to secure his prize, Juan Carlos did what his father Juan had always refused to do, and what Jaime could never do. He formally swore an oath of loyalty, not just to Spain, but to Franco's regime, to the principles of the national movement, Franco's fascist ideology. The betrayal was formalized on July 22, 1969, in a grand televised speech to the Cortes, the rubber-stamp parliament. Generalissimo Francisco Franco formally designated Prince Juan Carlos de Bourbon y Bourbon as his successor, with the new title Prince of Spain. It was a dagger in the back of both brothers. For Juan, it was a public humiliation that forced him into a political twilight. But for Jaime, it was something far worse. It was an erasure. It was the definitive final public judgment that his entire life, his fight, his claims, his kingdoms had all been a complete and total waste of time. The game was over. He had lost. His brother had lost. Franco, the ultimate puppet master, had won. Jaime was now a 61-year-old man. He was a political non-entity, a ghost at the feast, a footnote in his own family's history. His Jaimista faction in Spain evaporated. His Carlist faction, the Civatistas, descended into bitter, irrelevant obscurity. His French kingdom was all he had left, a world of aristocratic make-believe that had no bearing on reality. He was once again the unfit prince, discarded, defeated, and silenced, this time for good. And then, just when his story seemed to be over, fate delivered its final, cruel, and most bizarre twist. This was the Pyrrhic victory, a moment so surreal it almost defies belief. In 1971, 2 years after Juan Carlos had been anointed, the Spanish public was electrified by a stunning engagement announcement Jaime's eldest son, Alfonso de Bourbon, Duke of Anjou, the heir to all of his father's French and Carlist claims, was to marry Maria del Carmen Martínez Bourdieu y Franco, the caudillo's own beloved granddaughter. The political world was thrown into a frenzy. What did this mean? Was this a dynastic coup of breathtaking audacity? Was this Jaime's final brilliant move? Had he, after losing the political war, won the social one, marrying his son, his true heir, into the dictator's own family? Was Franco, even after naming Juan Carlos, having second thoughts? Was he using Jaime's son as a backup, a dynastic threat to be held over Juan Carlos's head? A reminder that the legitimate line was now part of his own family? For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed that Jaime, the ultimate underdog, had pulled off the checkmate of the century. Jaime himself was ecstatic. He was, in his own mind, completely vindicated. He saw this not as a social match, but as the true restoration. His son was marrying the princess of the new regime. He, Jaime, would be the patriarch of the real new dynasty. He was so consumed by this delusion that, at his son's wedding, a lavish state affair held at the Pardo Palace on March 8, 1972, he caused a major diplomatic incident. He insisted on being treated with the full honors and protocol of a reigning, visiting head of state as Henri VI of France. He refused to acknowledge his nephew Juan Carlos as the Prince of Spain, viewing him as the usurper. The wedding was a minefield of protocols, a silent, bitter war waged with seating charts and salutations. Jaime, for one glorious day, acted as if he had won, but it was all a mirage. It was the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory, a victory that was, in reality, a total defeat. Franco was not a sentimental man. He was not rewriting his succession plan because his granddaughter had fallen in love. He was, quite simply, indulging her. He was happy to see her marry a prince, even a pretend one. It gave his own upstart family a veneer of royal prestige. He was using Jaime's son, just as he had used Jaime. For his own personal and familial gain, the political decision was made. Juan Carlos was the future. Alfonso, his new son-in-law, was given a ceremonial job and the empty title Duke of Cadiz, but he was pointedly and publicly kept far from any real power. He was a son-in-law, not an heir. This was the final hollow echo of Jaime's life. He had been victorious only in seeing his son brought near the throne, but only as a servant, while his nephew was being groomed to sit on it. His victory was symbolic, social, and in the end, meaningless. It had cost him his last shred of dignity as he postured as a king at a wedding hosted by the very man who had destroyed him. He was a man who had claimed 3 crowns and was left with nothing, a guest in the palace of his enemy, watching his nephew prepare to rule the kingdom that by all the laws he held sacred should have been his. The end, when it came, was not a grand operatic finale. It was not a death in a palace surrounded by courtiers, nor a martyr's end on a battlefield, fighting for one of his theoretical kingdoms. The end was a quiet, clinical, and profoundly anticlimactic fade-out, a final whisper that perfectly mirrored the silence in which he had been forced to live. Prince Jaime, the Duke of Segovia, Duke of Anjou, and Duke of Madrid, the triple pretender king of France and Spain, died on March 20th, 1975. He was 66 years old. His death occurred not in Madrid, not in Paris, but in the sterile confines of the St. Gall Cantonal Hospital in Switzerland, the neutral nation that had been his lifelong refuge, his non-kingdom. He had been in and out of the hospital for weeks, his robust constitution finally failing him. He was a man who had survived his own flawed genetics, a botched surgery, and the political machinations of a continent, but he could not survive a simple final failure of the heart. He died, as he had lived, in exile, a man whose vast, grandiose claims to power ultimately evaporated in a quiet hospital room, far from any throne. The timing of his death was, perhaps, the final, most exquisite, and cruelest irony of his entire existence. For decades, his entire life struggle, his political maneuvering, his family feuds, his very identity, had all been focused on a single point in the future: the death of Generalissimo Francisco Franco and the subsequent restoration of the Spanish monarchy. That moment, the great hinge of fate for which he had prepared his entire adult life, was now just months away. Jaime died in March. 8 months later, on November 20th, 1975, General Franco, the man who had played him and his brother like puppets, the man who had held the crown of Spain in his fist for nearly 40 years, finally died in his bed in Madrid. 2 days after that, on November 22nd, 1975, Jaime's nephew, Juan Carlos I, the son of his despised rival, was proclaimed King of Spain before the Cortes. The great restoration had happened. The monarchy was back. And Jaime, the man who believed he was the only legitimate king, had missed it. He had died on the very precipice of the event that would have been his final definitive vindication or his ultimate public defeat. He was denied even that he was denied the chance to see the end of his own story, a final passive erasure from the narrative he had tried so desperately to write. His death did not create a power vacuum. In the way a reigning king's death does, it created something far more complex, a chaotic, messy, and contested inheritance of theoretical claims. In Spain, his death was a political footnote. Franco's choice of Juan Carlos in 1969 had already rendered his Jaimista Alfonsist claim null and void. His death merely confirmed it, and his small faction of supporters had nowhere to go but to grudgingly accept the new king or fade into total irrelevance. His Carlist claim, his Jaime IV title, suffered a similar fate. The Civatista Carlist faction that had crowned him was now truly and finally kingless. They were a movement of purists with no one pure left to follow, and they splintered into obscure extremist irrelevance, a historical curiosity. The other Carlist faction, led by the progressive Prince Carlos Hugo of Bourbon-Parma, was also failing, and Jaime's death merely removed one of his rivals from the board, though it did him little good. In Spain, the chaos of Jaime's legacy was one of dissolution. He had been a useful tool for Franco, a specter to haunt his brother Juan, and with his death the specter simply vanished. But in France, the chaos was one of succession. His claim as Henri VI, King of France and Navarre, was, by the legitimist laws he championed, not a personal title. It was an inherited fundamental right, and it passed on the instant of his death to his eldest son, Alfonso, Duke of Cadiz. This was the true, poisoned inheritance. Alfonso was now Alphonse II to the French legitimists, the new king in exile. And Alfonso's position was a paradox that even his father might have found dizzying. He was a Spanish prince born in Rome, living in Madrid, a Spanish citizen, and the son-in-law of the Spanish dictator who was now claiming to be the king of France. Furthermore, to accept this French claim, Alfonso had to publicly champion his father's legitimist logic that the 1933 renunciation was invalid, that blood primogeniture was the only thing that mattered. But this was the exact same argument his father had used to claim the Spanish throne. Alfonso was now in the bizarre position of having to implicitly claim that his cousin Juan Carlos was a usurper of the Spanish throne, while living in Madrid as a high-profile member of Juan Carlos's court and a relative of the old regime. It was a legal and political minefield, a legacy of contradiction. His mother, Emmanuelle de Dampierre, who had been bitterly divorced from Jaime, had reportedly encouraged her sons for years to drop the hopeless Spanish claim and focus exclusively on the purer, more legitimate French one. Jaime's chaotic personal life, his divorce, had thus directly shaped the fragmentation of his own legacy, cleaving his claims in two. This chaotic legacy, however, was not just one of legalistic tangles. It was a legacy of profound, almost Gothic personal tragedy. The Bourbon curse that had haunted Jaime's generation, the genetic fragility, the unfitness, the bad luck, did not die with him. It passed to his son, Alfonso, and it accelerated with a terrifying, brutal velocity. Alfonso, unlike his father, was the picture of royal perfection. He was tall, athletic, movie star handsome, and an accomplished skier. He had made the brilliant marriage to Franco's granddaughter. He seemed to have everything. But the inheritance from Jaime was not just a title, it was a shadow. The first tragedy struck in February 1984. Alfonso was driving his family back from a skiing trip in the Pyrenees. He collided with a truck. He and his younger son, Luis Alfonso, were injured. His eldest son, Francisco de Assis, who was just 11 years old and the heir to the French throne, was killed. The echo of the past was horrifying. Jaime's brothers, the hemophiliacs Alfonso and Gonzalo, had both died young in minor car accidents. The curse of the Bourbons, their fatal link to modern transportation, had struck again, this time taking the next generation. This event destroyed Alfonso's life. His marriage to Carmen, which was already failing, collapsed into a bitter divorce. The great Pyrrhic victory that Jaime had celebrated the union with the Franco family was over, dissolved in grief and recrimination. Alfonso was now a broken man, a king in name, but in reality a grieving father, increasingly isolated. And 5 years later, the final grotesque act of the legacy played out. On January 30th, 1989, in Beaver Creek, Colorado, Alfonso was preparing for the upcoming World Alpine Ski Championships. An accomplished skier, he was inspecting the downhill course with a small team. It was twilight. A worker was in the process of raising or lowering a heavy steel cable for a finish line banner. It was strung low across the course, unmarked and invisible in the flat light. Alfonso, skiing at a moderate speed, did not see it. He skied directly into the cable. It caught him at neck level. He was in an instant decapitated. The death of Alphonse II was not a grand royal event. It was a bizarre, gruesome, and almost surreally meaningless accident, a final destination death that defied all sense of dignity or purpose. He was a man who claimed to be a king by divine right, and he was killed by a piece of ski lift equipment. It was the ultimate black comedy punchline to the entire legitimist cause, a final horrifying symbol of the utter emptiness of his father's claims. The curse was complete. The chaotic legacy had culminated not in a restoration, but in a random, horrific, and pathetic end on a mountain in America. The claim to the French throne, the last remnant of Jaime's life's work, now passed to his only surviving son, Luis Alfonso, a Spanish teenager, the great-grandson of a dictator, who would become Louis XX, King of France. The fragmentation was absolute, but Infante Jaime's silent life had ended. The true, chaotic, and paradoxical consequence of that life was just about to unfold. He was the king who might have been, a man who was, from the age of 4, a victim of fate's cruelest irony. His disability, a direct consequence of the dynastic inbreeding that was supposed to guarantee his purity, was the flaw that silenced a potential ruler. But his true impact was not his failure. His impact was his struggle. His entire life was an act of defiant, stubborn, and destabilizing noise. He refused to be the silent, forgotten prince. By fighting for his rights, by retracting his renunciation, by claiming the French throne, by accepting the Carlist crown, he made himself an impossible problem. His very existence as the unfit but legitimist alternative was a constant nagging threat that destabilized his brother's claim. He and his liberal brother Juan, locked in their bitter, generation-long feud, effectively canceled each other out. They were the flawed generation, and in their mutual, toxic rivalry, they made themselves both unelectable in the eyes of the only man who mattered, Francisco Franco. This feud, which Jaime had fueled with his retraction, forced the caudillo to look elsewhere, to skip their entire generation, and choose the blank slate, the young, malleable Juan Carlos. And that is the final grand paradox. Jaime's life of tragedy, his unfitness, was an accidental and necessary sacrifice. By being so flawed, so compromised by his deafness and his divorce, he made himself the impossible choice. By doing so, he inadvertently cleared the path for his nephew Juan Carlos, the very man who would, in a twist neither Franco nor Jaime could have ever foreseen, betray the dictatorship and restore the very democracy his father, Juan, had always dreamed of. Jaime's struggle, his refusal to be silenced, highlighted all the flaws of the old monarchy, its inbreeding, its cruelty, its intolerance, and by making himself a political dead end, he accidentally paved the way for a new monarchy, a modern, constitutional, and democratic one, the only kind that could possibly survive. He was the silent prince whose greatest historical mark was the chaos he created, a man who, by fighting obsessively for the rigid laws of the past, inadvertently helped create a future he never could have imagined.